Hello and welcome to what for me is a rather brief Cinema 4D tutorial on a hidden magic trick that the program keeps well hidden up its sleeve. So in order to understand how this works, and a lot of people don't know about this functionality, so it's why I call it an Easter egg, we're going to start with a very simple scene. We've got two splines here. One is a triangle with 3 sides and one is a shape with 12 sides, which is technically called a dodecagon. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a cloner. And this is some basic MoGraph revision here, just so we understand the normal mode of operation for this sort of setup. I'm going to take both of these splines and I'm going to make them children of the cloner, so we get some clones. I'm just going to zero out here on the y-axis and I'll distribute them along the x. And let's make, I don't know, let's make 10 copies. So we've got some alternating clones here at the moment, and that's because the default clones mode here is set to iterate, where it goes through all of the list and then goes back to the beginning again. And we actually have 4 modes of operation here. The one that we're interested in is called the blend mode. And this works quite nicely with splines often because you get this interesting effect, which itself not everybody knows about. So here what we've got is we're blending from the first spline to the last spline's shapes. So we're getting polygons with all of the numbers of sides in between 3 and 12 going up to the final one. Now, this is kind of what you'd expect. You have to be a bit careful with this when you work with more complex geometry because you can get some funky results which aren't that easy to control in Cinema 4D. But this is a fairly well documented way of using the blend clone mode to get from one shape to another. So let's move on to the Easter egg and see something that's a bit less expected. So in this first example, I've made a little graph here that I've created using a formula effected on a matrix. It's an elegant little formula here, which is the sign of the square of each of the IDs of the matrix. And we get this rather interesting looking little loop, which goes on both the positive and the negative axis. But what we need to do is we need to populate these axes with numbers, which is obviously a pretty simple thing to do, but it can be quite tedious if you're going to do it manually with individual numbers. So we're going to look at this trick here, this Easter egg, using text objects. So up here we have this little menu now in R25. The mode text has been replaced with just a text object. I'm going to select that because I don't need to do anything to it to make it renderable. It's already extruded, but it comes out with this enormous size. I'm probably going to make it a fraction bigger than we need, just so that you can see on the tutorial a bit better. I'm going to middle the text and I'm going to start, let's say, with the number 0, just so we've got something in the middle here. Again, I'm going to open my little hot corner and I'm going to put my number text here, which is black. So again, you can see it a bit better. Now we're going to use a cloner to create these numbers. So I'm just going to hold the Alt key down and press cloner, which makes the cloner a parent of my currently selected object. I get some rather unhelpful default numbers here. Now what I want to do is I want to duplicate these numbers all the way along, and our scale here is going to go from -10 to 10 with 0 in the middle. So that's going to mean I'm going to need 21 clones because I need the 1 for the 0 in the middle. And what you could do is make 21 clones, and let's say they go 10 centimeters each. Now the problem with the linear mode with cloners, I find, is they are always sort of left aligned, and that can be quite annoying if you want things that are symmetrical. So instead what I tend to do is I go for a grid array which is centered, and what I'll do is I make my Y and my Z axes just 1, and then I'm going to make my X axis 21 clones, and I'm going to set the step to 10. And as you can see there, because it's centered, it's now going to create them on the left and the right of our world axis, which is exactly what we need. And I can just move it down slightly so it's below the line here. So we have a 0. We want to go from -10 to 10. Now, if I make a second text object and I just control drag it up, so we've got 2 copies now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this -10, which is the start of our range on the left, and then I'm going to make the second one 10, the range we want on the right. And what you can see here is, well, hopefully you can see, let's just make these exaggeratedly large for now so you can see them a bit better. What we actually have is -10, 10, -10, 10. So these are alternating at the moment because we have our clones mode set to iterate. But something magical is going to happen when we set this to blend mode, because unlike our first example where we were blending normal splines and their shape would gradually morph from one to the other, This little Easter egg here means that internally this has been coded so that it understands numbers when you put them into text objects. This will work with the text spline and the text object, or motext if you're using an earlier example, an earlier version of Cinema 4D. And now you can see that we've had this created instantly for us exactly as we want. Now, if we wanted to, say, display the half increments, so 0.5, 1.5, 2.5, etc. in here, that's also very easy to do. We just need to figure out how many clones we need. Now, we're actually going to need 41 here because we need 40 for all of the numbers plus that extra one. And when we do that, you can see that we get 2.5. Now, what we also need to do is just set the end step. And of course, now they are a bit too big. So if we set the size of our objects down and our cloner, just move it up a fraction. Now we've got these half increments nicely, which hopefully you can see. So the way that it does the numbering internally is it'll divide up the total number of clones between the range. So you can get fractions of numbers as well, depending on the maths. If you thought that there should be 40 here because we're going from -10 to 10, you would get some slightly weird numbers. So that's a bit of an alarm bell that you've probably done your maths slightly wrong if you're expecting that. These are getting into very high decimal numbers because they're funny fractions. So you have to just get exactly the right number of clones that you need to display the range as required. Now, if we just jump across here to a finished example, I've done both axes, both the X and the Y, and just a little trick. I've used two plane effectors with a little box field in the middle here just to nudge our numbers out the way of the axis because they can run across that center line and that horizontal line, so that just pops them out of the way like you would expect to see on some sort of professional graphing calculator. Cool, so on to another little example. So here we have a very simple scene which just has a clock model, which is one of the standard assets in your Cinema 4D asset browser. It's a very nicely made model, but when we analyze how these numbers are created, we can't be sure how they were done by the modeler. I suggest that they probably did them with a cloner, but what we've ended up here is a lot of nulls, which we'll see why there are nulls in a minute, and also these text splines, which have been connected together and then put under an extrude object so that we can see them in the render. Now, this is the way that you might think you have to tackle something like this again, where you have to make 12 numbers and you have to put them somehow in an array, a radial array or a radial cloner. But we're going to avoid that hassle by doing it the Easter egg way. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make, again, I'll make a text object, not a text spline in this case, so it just shorthands a few of the steps in making it renderable. The depth is massive. All these numbers are huge by default, and you can change those if you want to, but I'm just going to knock these down so they're sort of right. We're going to middle align it. And then the first thing I'm going to do is put it under a cloner. So I'm going to hold down my Alt key so that becomes a parent. We can't see it because I'm going to need to bring it forward a little bit. So it's in front of the face of the clock there. And again, I'll open the material hot corner and I'll just drop a plastic material on that came with the asset so we can see it better. So we have the word text. So again, the first thing we need to do is we need to make this our number range. So our first number, let's just drag this up, very limited space here, is obviously 12 on a clock. Our second number, so I'm just control dragging that down, I'm going to make 12. And our cloner, we want in this case to be a radial array, and we want it to be on the X and Y axis, not as it is by default, and it's way too big, so let's just drag it in till it's about right, something like 12 centimeters, and obviously we're going to need 12 clones, 12 numbers. Now, you can see that this is not exactly as we had before because these numbers are aligned, which is what we don't want because they in a clock, they all tend to be up facing or upright facing. So I'll just turn off the alignment. And you can see that already something's slightly awry. The numbers at the top, and it's in iterate mode, remember, by default, so it's just going 112, 112 at the moment. This looks about right up here, but as we get near the bottom, we're not close to the bottom face. And that's because when we take this out of align mode, we have this baseline here at the bottom of the text. Now, in the numbers at the bottom, the number 6 we're going to create, we want that to be close to the pips here. But here, we want it to be further away in the top of the text, which is not the baseline. We want to be at the top. So we can get around that fairly easily by just putting these under nulls, which I'm going to do now. So I'm just going to select both these objects, hold my Alt key down, and I'm going to press the null object up here. And then I'm just going to select both of the text objects and move them down till the clock is about in the middle. So that the alignment is now happening based on the null. And so that's in the middle of each of the items, and we're not worried about baseline grids anymore. The radius is now a bit small. I'm going to hold down my Alt key so I can go up in slightly smaller increments than default. And now we've got something that looks about right. And all I need to do to get our numbers is to set this to blend mode. And again, the magic happens. The only problem we've got here is the 1 is at the top, which for those of you that can tell the time know that that's not correct. So I'm going to need to nudge this around by 30 degrees. And there we go. We've recreated our clock using just 2 text objects and a cloner. And we've done that very, very quickly. And it's interesting to note that this does work also under null objects. So you don't just need the naked text splines or text objects to be directly under your cloner. Also, interestingly, if you turn off the second clone, only the number 12 disappears. So if you ever need a clock that has no number 12, there you go. There's another little Easter egg for you. All right, let's just quickly move on to a final example. So have you ever needed a counter that counts from one number to another? Well, you're in luck. We can use this trick to also do that very simply. So here I've got the most simple scene with a text spline only. I'm going to put that under a cloner, and I'm going to make another text spline. Now I've made that first text spline the number 0. I'm going to make the second one, let's say 100. Now, let's just look at another little trick that I often use. Because we can't see what these numbers are, that can get a bit annoying, especially when one of them is going to be hidden because we're only going to see one number at a time. So what I often do when I've got situations like this, I use the name of the object to be influenced by some sort of parameter. And that's really easy to do with Expresso, even if you don't know any Expresso, because if I right click on this text spline number here, and I come down to this little expression submenu and I say set driver, I can go to the same object's basic tab, and this is where it's getting its name that we see in the object manager from. I can right click again and I can go back to expressions and say set driven. And what that's going to do is going to make the number that we've got written in here the driver for the name of the object itself. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to say set driver by right clicking on the text spline field here. I'm going to go back to its basic tab on the other object, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to say set driven. So both of these text splines now have their name actually being controlled by the number. So if I was to change the numbers again, the name of it would catch up, so we can always tell what the number is. Okay, there's another little trick. So if I set my cloner to blend mode as we've done previously, we've currently got 3 copies and they're going up 50 in the y-axis by default. So now we've got 3 copies that we see on top of each other. Now we don't want this, we only want to see 1 at a time. So I'm actually in this case going to set the count just to 1, which at the moment means that we only see the first clone 0. So how do we get this to work as a counter? Well, it's actually incredibly simple. If I select my cloner object and then make a plane effector, by selecting the cloner, that makes it automatically appear in the effectors tab here. Our plane effector by default wants to push all of the clones up 100 centimeters, so I can switch that off. And in fact, I don't want any of the position, rotation, or scale attributes to be affected. In this case, what I want is this lesser known little field here called the modify clone. Now what this is going to do is it's not going to affect the position, rotation or scale of the object, but it's going to affect which clone we see from the first to the last in the list. So as you can see, we already, as we drag up the modify clones scale here, we get the counter that we're looking for. So all you need to do to get an animating counter is to simply keyframe this. Now, if I push this up to 100, we also get a similar effect if we use its strength slider, and I tend to use strength sliders more because they're a bit more obvious what they do. They are the strength. Modify clone is a little bit more an abstract concept. Now what you might want to do is also have a counter that works in increments of maybe less than whole numbers. Now there's one way of doing this which I find a little bit harder to understand. If I, for instance, put the modify clone setting down to 50%, we're only going to get a strength slider that works from 0 to 50. But what that means is that we can get these increments still because we've got 100 numbers going in half points. So we've got that kind of half point behavior that we managed to recreate on the graph example. Now, if we were to keyframe this, we wouldn't necessarily get the behavior we were expecting with these nice half-step increments. I can just quickly demonstrate that. If I'm on frame 99 here, if I go back to frame 0 and I make my strength 0, and let's say I go to frame 99, and I set my strength to 100, you might think that we're going to get half-step increments like we just saw when we dragged the slider. But in actual fact, we don't. We get crazy numbers. And that's because no matter what we do, when we move on frame by frame, it's always going to figure out what the number is halfway between the number on the previous frame and on the subsequent frame. So we can't get that half step behavior simply by keyframing the slider with linear keyframes. So how do we do that? Well, we can do that, and we can also affect the speed at which the counter changes quite easily. So I've got these keyframes already set up here that aren't quite working for us. If I use my little hot corner here, and I'll just drag my plane effector in here, I'll go into F-curve mode and I'll hit H to frame my track. So you can see I've got these straight line values. What I can do is I can take this keyframe, and what we're going to do is, instead of defining the whole range by a straight line, we're just going to define one keyframe. Let's say I want to change numbers every 10 frames, or from 0 to 10, well, let's say 9 then. So that's 10 frames, from frame 0 to frame 9. If I select all of my keyframes and I change their behavior to step, what we're going to do is, instead of going between all the values, it's just going to have the first value until the key changes, and then it's going to step up to the next value. And if I select my track again, I can also set my post behavior to offset repeat, and then I'm just going to get this stair stepping effect. So now we're going up in nice even increments, and it's not working because this value here, which I can use my power slider to select, is 100%. So if I set this to 1%, we're going to get a half increment, because we've got 100 clones. We're only going to 50 on the scale though, because we've got our modified clone set as 50%. So now we've got our half step increments going up every 10 frames. And so you can obviously play with that to your heart's content, to change the numbers, to change the increments, and to change the speed that your counter moves at. Now, one final thing that you might want to do with this is to use it in a more future UI sort of context, where you've got lots and lots of displays showing random numbers. And the basic principle for that is pretty easy to show. What I've done is I've just created another little scene here, and I've copied that exact rig over, and I've just got rid of the keyframe. So we're back to this original setup. We've got our strength 100, our modified clones 100, and a cloner with numbers from 0 to 100 here. So just as a very quick example, let's create a cloner of these clones. So if I hold down my Option key, Alt key, and I select another cloner, I'm going to get a clone of these cloners. And in a very boring linear mode here. So what I'll do is, let's set this to, say, a radial mode, and we'll have them facing, we'll make 10 copies, just so we can see them. So this might be some sort of dial that you've got going on, with usually random, fancy, funny graphics going on in the middle. And at the moment, we've only got 100 because we've got these all doing exactly the same thing. But what I can do here is I can take my plane effector, and obviously I can start to use fields. So if I select a random field, something interesting already is beginning to happen here. We've now got random numbers, and that's because each of these clones of clones is sitting in a different space in this noise. If I switch on my view settings, you can see that they'll all be getting different values depending on where each of the points sits on that noise field. So we've already got random numbers doing this, and we can very quickly, with a random field, we can animate them. In the Fields tab here, we've got an animation speed for most of the field noises. I'm sticking with the default Perlin for a second. So if I set the animation speed to 100 and just press play, we're already getting that random dial sort of effect going for us, which is brilliant. Now, if you were to ask me, yes, but I need these to go in whole numbers, not fractions, you know, I consider you to be a pain in the arse client, but that is indeed very easy to do also, because if I, on my random field, go to its remapping, now I have a contour mode at the bottom here. What I can do is I can set it to quantize, which I think is just off the bottom of the screen on this list. But if I do that, we're already getting whole numbers. If I set this to 100, which is the number of numbers that I've got, it will create this stair-stepping effect, which is very, very fine grade here. If you make it 10 or something, you can see the steps much more easily. But you can create different steps of numbers doing this quantize mode. You can also use the step mode, contour mode. And here we're getting this behavior. If I set this to 100, we're just going to get one of any of those 100 numbers going on at any one time. And you can change the speed that this happens by changing your animation speed of your noise field. So there you go, a lovely new toy for you to play with to your heart's content. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also leave me some comments underneath. If you've done any interesting work using these ideas, I'd really like to see them. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at MeshMashUK. Hopefully I'll see you all very soon. And don't forget, there's no such thing as being lucky, so you'd better be good.